In October 1942, while Zhukov and Vasilevsky were preparing their great encirclement of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, Rommel was in Germany on sick leave. He had been suffering from stress, with low blood pressure and intestinal problems. His last attempt to break through the Eighth Army in the Battle of El Alamein had failed. Many of his troops were also ill, as well as desperately short of food, fuel, and ammunition. After all his dreams of conquering Egypt and the Middle East had turned to ashes, Rommel refused to accept personal responsibility. He went on to convince himself that General Field Marshal Kesselring had deliberately held back supplies for the Panzer Army Africa out of jealousy. The Panzer Army Africa's position was indeed serious. The Italians in the rear areas and the Luftwaffe were keeping the bulk of the supplies for themselves. German morale was very low. Thanks to ultra-intercepts, Allied submarine attacks and bombing sank even more freighters in October. Hitler's distrust of his Anglophile allies convinced him that German transports were being betrayed to the English by the Italians. The possibility that German Enigma codes were being broken did not occur to him. General der Panzertruppe George Stumm, the corps commander who had been court-martialed for the loss of the plans for Operation Blau, commanded the army in Rommel's absence, and Generalleutnant Wilhelm von Thoma took over the Afrika Corps. Hitler and the OKW did not believe that the British would attack before the next spring, and therefore there was still a chance for the Panzer Army Africa to break through to the Nile Delta. Rommel and Stumm were more realistic. They knew that they could do little in the face of Allied air power and the Royal Navy's attacks on their supply convoys. Rommel was further dismayed by the complacency he encountered in Berlin when he received his Field Marshal's baton. Göring dismissed Allied air power, saying, "Americans can only make razor blades." "Herr Reichsmarschall," Rommel replied, "I wish we had such razor blades." Hitler promised to send 40 of the new Tiger tanks, together with units of Nebelwerfer multi-barreled rocket launchers, as if these would be more than enough to make up for his shortages. The OKW played down any suggestion that the Allies might land in Northwest Africa in the immediate future. Only the Italians took the threat seriously. They made contingency plans to occupy French Tunisia, a project which the Germans opposed for fear of resistance from the Vichy French forces. In fact, Allied planning for Operation Torch was more advanced than even the Italians suspected. In early September, Eisenhower's headaches began to lessen as transatlantic disagreements were resolved. There would be simultaneous landings at Casablanca on the Atlantic coast and at Oran and Algiers in the Mediterranean. But the supply problem, due to confusion and a shortage of shipping, became a nightmare for his Chief of Staff, Major General Walter Bedell Smith. Most of the troops crossing the Atlantic arrived without weapons or equipment, so amphibious training was delayed. On the diplomatic front, both the American and British governments began to reassure Franco's regime in Spain that they had no intention of violating Spanish sovereignty, either in North Africa or on the mainland. This was necessary to counter German rumors that the Allies planned to seize the Canary Islands. Fortunately, the pragmatic General Conde Francisco de Jordana was again foreign minister after Franco had removed his pro-Nazi and overambitious brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano sooner. The diminutive and elderly Jordana was determined to keep Spain out of the war, and his appointment in September was a great relief to the Allies. Stumm, although lacking precise intelligence, remained certain that Montgomery was preparing a major offensive. He stepped up patrol activity and accelerated the laying of nearly 500,000 mines in so-called Devil's Gardens in front of the Panzer Army Africa's positions. Following Rommel's guidance, Stumm strengthened the Italian formations with German units and split the Afrika Corps, with the 15th Panzer Division behind the northern part of the front and the 21st Panzer Division in the south. General Alexander acted as an umbrella, shielding Montgomery from Churchill's impatience. Montgomery needed time to train his new forces, especially Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden's ex-Armored Corps, which he proudly and over-optimistically called his Corps de Chasse. The newly arrived Shermans were being prepared, bringing the 8th Army's strength up to over 1,000 tanks. Lumsden, a flamboyant cavalryman who had won the Grand National, was hardly Montgomery's favorite, but Alexander liked him. Montgomery's plan, Operation Lightfoot, consisted of making his main attack in the northern sector, which was also the most heavily defended. He assumed that the Germans would not expect this. Lumsden's X Corps was to exploit the breakthrough once XXX Corps made it across the minefield south of the coast road. With the aid of a sophisticated deception plan carried out by Major Jasper Maskelyne, a professional illusionist, Montgomery hoped to persuade the Germans that his main push was coming in the south, so that they would move their forces down there. Maskelyne installed hundreds of dummy vehicles and even a fake water pipeline in the southern sector. Radio traffic was stepped up in the area, transmitting pre-recorded signals, while trucks drove around towing chains behind the lines to stir up dust. To lend weight to this vital part of Montgomery's plan, Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks' 13 Corps would attack, followed by the 7th Armored Division and supported by a third of his artillery. On the extreme left of the Alamein line, Koenig's Free French would attack the strong Italian position of El Heimamat on the edge of the Katara Depression, but they lacked sufficient support for such a difficult objective. On October 19th, the Desert Air Force and the Americans began to launch a series of bombing and strafing raids against Luftwaffe airfields. 4 days later, at 20:40 hours on October 23rd, Montgomery's artillery opened a massive bombardment of Axis positions. The ground trembled from the shock waves, and the muzzle flashes illuminated the entire nighttime horizon. From a distance it looked like sheet lightning. Allied bombers attacked the reserve positions and rear areas. General Stumm, afraid of using up his ammunition, ordered his own artillery not to respond. Since dusk, sappers had been moving slowly forward as the moon rose, prodding the sand with bayonets and lifting mines to create corridors marked by white tape and oil lamps. At 22:00 hours, XXX Corps started to advance through them with 4 divisions: the 51st Highland, 9th Australian, 1st South African and 2nd New Zealand, each supported by at least 1 armoured regiment. The newly arrived Highlanders went in with pipes skirling and bayonets fixed, having heard that the Italian troops seemed to fear cold steel more than almost anything else. Infantry casualties were comparatively light, but, to Montgomery's irritation, the tanks of Lumsden's X Corps became mixed up in the minefields. The delays meant that they were hit hard once dawn came. General Stumm wanted to see the situation at the front for himself, but when his vehicle came under fire the driver drove away, not realizing that Stumm had got out. Stumm died from a heart attack and his body was not found until the following day. When General von Thoma heard the news and took command, he was reluctant to launch a major counterattack, because he did not dare use up fuel before his forces were resupplied. But on October 25th, both the 15th Panzer Division in the north and 21st Panzer in the south put in successful local responses. Montgomery's master plan was not going well. The Germans had not swallowed his feint, and no forces had been sent to the south to face the diversionary attack by 13 Corps. Meanwhile, in the north, the German minefields and Axis resistance had proved much stronger than expected. Montgomery unfairly blamed the 10th Armored Division, even accusing it of cowardice, when in fact it was being misused. Montgomery's anti-cavalry prejudice did not help him learn how best to use his armor. On hearing of the British offensive and Stumm's death, Rommel ordered a plane to fly him to Africa via Rome. He reached his headquarters at dusk on October 25th, having heard in Rome that the fuel situation was worse than ever due to the Royal Navy and the Allied air forces. The British attack was then helped when the Australians captured 2 German officers carrying detailed maps of their minefields. The Australians seized a key hill during the night, which they held against heavy counterattacks the next day. With the build-up of XXX Corps and X Corps, the pressure in the north on the Panzerarmee Africa was becoming irresistible. Rommel then heard that the tanker on which they had been counting had also been sunk. He warned OKW that with little fuel and a lack of ammunition, he would find it hard to continue the battle. By now it was clear that Montgomery was concentrating the bulk of his forces in the north, so Rommel moved the 21st Panzer Division up to help. Without the necessary fuel for his panzers to withdraw and fight a battle of movement in the open, he was now tied down to a slogging match which he could not win. Over half his panzers had been destroyed, falling victim either to the 6-pounder anti-tank gun or to air attacks. The new 40mm gun on the American P-39 Airacobras proved a most effective tank-busting weapon. Montgomery, forced to change his plan in the face of such a determined defense, prepared a new offensive while the Australians bore the brunt of the continuing counterattacks. On November 2nd, Operation Supercharge began in the early hours, with another heavy bombardment accompanied by air attacks. Montgomery sent in the 9th Armored Brigade in a charge against dug-in anti-tank guns. He was warned that it would be suicidal, but replied that it had to be done. The attack proved another balaclava, and the brigade was virtually wiped out. Freiberg's New Zealand division advanced well north of Kidney Ridge, but German counterattacks with both panzer divisions prevented a breakthrough. Containing the bridgehead, however, represented the Panzerarmee's last effort. Montgomery was finally winning the battle of attrition. Rommel gave orders to withdraw towards Fuca, even though he knew that the unmotorized troops, mostly Italian, would be rapidly overrun. Many German troops seized Italian trucks for themselves at gunpoint, producing ugly scenes. That evening Rommel sent a message to the OKW, outlining the situation and giving reasons for his retreat. Due to a misunderstanding on the part of a staff officer, Hitler did not receive the signal until the next morning. Suspecting a conspiracy to prevent him from countermanding Rommel's retreat, Hitler became incoherent with rage, and hysterical scenes ensued at Führer headquarters. The shock of Rommel's defeat was totally unexpected because Hitler's attention had been focused on Stalingrad and the Caucasus. His belief in Rommel as a commander had made him incapable of imagining such a setback. Shortly after midday on November 3rd, he sent Rommel an order. In the position in which you find yourself, there can be no other thought than to stand fast, not to take even one step back, and to throw every available weapon and soldier into the battle. He promised Luftwaffe support and supplies and finished. This is not the first time in history that resolute determination will prevail over the stronger battalions of the enemy. There is only one choice you can offer your troops: victory or death. Rommel was shaken and bewildered by the insanity of this command. Yet Hitler's self-deluding lies that enabled him to reject the reality of defeat would be repeated very soon afterwards, to General Paulus in the Don steppe west of Stalingrad. Rommel, despite all his military instincts, felt he had to obey. He issued orders to halt the withdrawal. Only the Italian divisions in the south were told to move northwestwards. This allowed Horrocks's 13 Corps to advance unopposed on November 4th. Further north, X Corps broke through, capturing the Afrika Korps headquarters and General von Thoma, who surrendered to the 10th Hussars. Assured of Kesselring's support, Rommel ordered a general retreat. He told Hitler that it would only be to the Fuca line, but it carried on all the way across Libya. That the remnants of the Panzer Army got away at all was due to Montgomery's slow reactions and excessive caution. Having achieved his victory, he did not want to risk any reverse. It has been argued that his failure to trap Rommel in his retreat prompted Hitler's disastrous decision to send more troops to North Africa, all of whom would eventually be captured. But this is hardly a testimonial to Montgomery's generalship, since that was never part of any master plan. The victory of Alamein had certainly not been won by strategic or tactical genius. Montgomery's decision to attack the strongest part of the German line was questionable, to say the least. His infantry and armored troops had certainly fought bravely, greatly helped by his success in turning around the Eighth Army's mood. But in most respects, the battle had been won by the formidable contribution of the Royal Artillery and by the Desert Air Force in its relentless destruction of the Luftwaffe, panzers and supply lines, as well as by the Royal Navy and the Allied Air Forces cutting the Axis lifeline in the Mediterranean. On November 7th, when Hitler was traveling to Munich to make his speech to the Nazi Party Old Guard, his special train was halted in Thuringia. A message from the Wilhelmstrasse warned that an Allied landing in North Africa was imminent. He promptly gave orders that Tunisia was to be defended. But when informed that the Luftwaffe would be able to do little at such a range from its bases, he became furious with Göring. All the conflicting rumors over the past few months about Allied intentions, and his obsession with the final capture of Stalingrad, had meant that the OKW was completely unprepared for a new front. The big question was how the Vichy regime would react to an Allied invasion of its North African colonies. Ribbentrop joined the train at Bamberg and urged Hitler to let him make overtures to Stalin through the Soviet ambassador in Stockholm. Hitler rejected the suggestion out of hand. The idea of negotiating at a moment of weakness was unthinkable. He continued to work on the speech which claimed that the German capture of Stalingrad was imminent, and emphasized his resolve to fight on until final victory. His pride prevented him from considering any other option. He passed over Rommel's defeat and never mentioned the Allied landings in North Africa, preferring to hark back to his prediction that the Jews would be annihilated. Yet even Goebbels recognized that they were standing at a turning point of the war. Apart from fanatically loyal Nazis, most Germans now felt that victory was further away than ever, as reports on civilian morale by the Sicherheitsdienst showed only too clearly. Few shared Göring's notion that the Americans were capable of manufacturing only razor blades. The mounting Allied bombing offensive against their cities demonstrated a growing material superiority. For Eisenhower and his planners, the reaction of Vichy France and Franco's regime in Spain had also been a key question. The politically naive Eisenhower soon found that he had entered a minefield of French politics. Roosevelt did not want to have anything to do with General de Gaulle, and he put pressure on Churchill not to tell the Frenchman what was afoot. Churchill's relationship with de Gaulle had been even more strained by French suspicions that the British coveted Syria and Lebanon, and Churchill knew that he would be furious at being kept in the dark. De Gaulle would also never accept that in order to avoid heavy fighting the Allies had to come to some arrangement with the Vichy authorities in North Africa. But Churchill had one offering in the hope of pacifying the proud general. The Royal Navy, unable to forget that Japanese aircraft flying from Vichy airfields in Indochina had sunk the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, continued to be concerned by the French colony of Madagascar, which lay parallel to their convoy routes off the southeast African coast. Within a few weeks of the disaster off Malaya, a landing force was allocated to Operation Ironclad, the seizure of the main port Diego Suarez, at the northern tip of Madagascar. At first, both General Brooke in London and Wavell in the Far East had opposed the plan when so much else was threatened. Then, at the beginning of March 1942, American intercepts of Japanese naval codes had revealed that Berlin was urging Tokyo to intervene in the western Indian Ocean to attack British supply ships going round southern Africa to Egypt. On March 12, the War Cabinet finally approved Operation Ironclad. At the beginning of May, the British force, sailing from South Africa, stormed the port of Diego Suarez with Marines landed at night in fine Nelsonian style. That was as far as the plan went, for it was assumed that a modus vivendi would be established with the Vichy authorities in the capital of Tananarive. But on May 30th, a Japanese midget submarine torpedoed the battleship HMS Ramillies in the harbor of Diego Suarez. The Japanese submarine flotilla went on to sink 23 ships with supplies for the Eighth Army, marking the only direct assistance which the Japanese gave their German ally during the war. A reluctant Churchill, persuaded by Field Marshal Smuts that the Japanese might establish bases in other Vichy ports on Madagascar, agreed to the conquest of the whole island. He also thought it might be a way of pacifying de Gaulle, who had wanted to take the island with free French forces and then been furious to discover that the British planned to deal with the Vichy authorities there. Once the whole island was captured, it could be handed over to de Gaulle. This was finally achieved on November 5, after a fruitless guerrilla campaign waged by the Vichy governor Armand Annette. A week before Annette's surrender, Churchill had been able to inquire graciously of General de Gaulle whom he would like to appoint as governor of Madagascar. De Gaulle suspected that the Allies were planning to land in North Africa, but if he had known of all the American dealings with Vichy generals that had been going on to prepare for Operation Torch, he would probably have stormed out of the room. Robert Murphy, who had been the American charge d'affaires in Vichy and was now Roosevelt's emissary in French North Africa, was also convinced that de Gaulle should be kept out of the picture entirely. For most officers of the French colonial army, de Gaulle was still seen as little better than a traitor in the pay of the English. They needed to be reassured with a figurehead to their liking. General Henri Giroux was a tall and brave officer with a magnificent mustache, but not famed for his intelligence. De Gaulle called him the Tin Soldier. Giroux, who had been captured at the head of the French 7th Army in 1940, had escaped from Königstein, a fortress prison in Saxony. He had made his way to Vichy, where Pierre Laval, Pétain's prime minister, had wanted to hand him back to the Germans, but the Maréchal refused. Murphy felt that Giroux could best serve Allied interests, but Giroux had his own ideas. He insisted that he should be the commander-in-chief of Operation Torch, and he demanded that the Allies should land in France as well as North Africa. He also did not want the British involved, since the Royal Navy attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir had not been forgotten or forgiven. Giroux was also a close friend of General Charles Mast, a key commander of French forces in North Africa. Murphy, who had developed a network of contacts among senior officers and officials, arranged a secret meeting between General Mast and his fellow conspirators with Eisenhower's deputy, Lieutenant General Mark Clark. On the night of October 21st, Clark had been landed near Algiers from the British submarine HMS Seraph, accompanied by commando bodyguards. His main task was to convince Mast that the American forces would be so overwhelming that the French should not attempt to oppose them. Clark claimed that 500,000 men would be landed, when the forces consisted of only 112,000. Mast warned him that, although the Army and Air Force could be won over, the French Navy would resist with determination. Other French officers provided Clark with valuable intelligence on the disposition of their troops and defenses. Fear of discovery by the local gendarmerie, who had been told that smugglers had landed, led to Clark's undignified return to the submarine the following night without his trousers. Despite this minor humiliation, his dangerous mission had proved largely successful. The submarine HMS Seraph, this time pretending to be American, was sent to collect Giroux from the Côte d'Azur and then convey him to Gibraltar to join Eisenhower. Axis agents and air reconnaissance reported the growing presence of shipping at Gibraltar. Fortunately for the Allies, German intelligence assumed that the vessels were intended either to reinforce Malta or to land forces in Libya to cut off Rommel's line of retreat. German U-boats in the Mediterranean were therefore ordered to concentrate off the Libyan coast, well to the east of where the invasion forces were going to land. Another Axis theory was that the Allies intended to take Dakar on the West African coast as a naval base, to help them in the Battle of the Atlantic. Through Murphy, the Americans had received overtures from Admiral Darla. Admiral William D. Leahy, Roosevelt's former ambassador to Vichy, saw Darla as a dangerous opportunist. The fact that Darla loathed Laval, who had replaced him as Pétain's deputy, was hardly a guarantee of his trustworthiness. Yet even Churchill was prepared to have dealings with this most determined Anglophobe, if it might lead to the French fleet at Toulon coming over to the Allied side. Eisenhower preferred to stick with Giroux, but then Giroux, on reaching Gibraltar, again expected to be made Allied commander-in-chief. Seldom had a military operation been so complicated by politics and personal rivalries. On November 4th, just 4 days before the landings, Darla, who had been on a tour of French African colonies, flew to Algiers. He had just heard that his son, a naval lieutenant suffering from polio, had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. Darla had no idea that Allied fleets were at sea, and when his son's condition improved he planned to fly back to Vichy. Western Task Force, containing 35,000 troops commanded by Major General George S. Patton, had already left Hampton Roads, bound for Casablanca. The other two task forces which had sailed from England were headed into the Mediterranean for Oran and Algiers. Altogether, the troopships were escorted by 300 warships under the overall command of Admiral Cunningham, who was delighted to return to the Mediterranean. On the evening of November 7th, Darla was at dinner at the Villa d'Olivers, the residence of General Alphonse Juin, the commander-in-chief in Algiers. Juin had replaced Weygand, who was now imprisoned at Königstein in Giroux's place because Hitler feared that he would side with the Allies. They were interrupted towards the end by the chief naval officer at Algiers, who rushed in to tell them that the Allied ships were perhaps not heading for Malta after all. They might be coming to land troops at Algiers and Oran. Darla dismissed such fears and went off to get some sleep before his flight early next morning. At midnight, Murphy heard the code word over the French service of the BBC to confirm that the landings were going ahead. He sent the French irregulars that he and General Mast had recruited to seize key installations and headquarters. In the early hours of November 8th, Murphy went to the Villa Olivers and had Juin woken. He informed him of the landings. Juin was dumbstruck at first. He then said that he must first consult his senior officer Admiral Darla, who was present in Algiers. Murphy felt that he had no alternative but to talk to Darla. Murphy's Buick was sent to fetch him. Darla arrived in a fury. The short, bald, barrel-chested admiral, who constantly smoked a pipe, was soon nicknamed Popeye by the Americans, who were amused by his built-up shoes. Darla's hatred for the English had an illustrious pedigree since his great-grandfather had been killed at the Battle of Trafalgar. But he was also a practiced turncoat. Just after the armistice in 1940, the veteran French politician Édouard Herriot had said of him, "This admiral knows how to swim," when Darla, having promised the British total resistance, secretly joined the capitulars. While Murphy was trying to calm Darla and persuade him that resistance to the landings would be futile, a group of Mast's irregulars turned up and took Darla and Juin prisoner. Then a squad of gendarmerie arrived to release them and take the insurgents and Murphy prisoner. Murphy had been expecting American troops to have arrived by this time, but they had landed by mistake further down the coast. But a far greater disaster was unfolding. The British plan to take both the ports of Algiers and Oran in a coup de main was a complete failure, involving massive casualties, especially in Oran, where 189 men were killed and 157 wounded out of a force of 393 men, while the Royal Navy lost 113 dead and 86 wounded. This, not surprisingly, provoked considerable American anger. In the harbor, French shore batteries and naval vessels bombarded 2 Royal Navy destroyers flying the Stars and Stripes as they attempted to bring in American landing parties, just as they had at Diego Suarez. An airborne operation with a single American parachute battalion to capture Oran's airfields also proved a fiasco. Operation Torch appeared to be falling to pieces in a grotesque farce. Despite Roosevelt's request to keep the Free French in ignorance, Churchill had asked General Ismay to call General Pierre Bellot, de Gaulle's chief of staff, to warn him of the invasion just before the troops began to land. But Bellot decided not to wake de Gaulle, who had gone to bed early. When de Gaulle heard the news next morning, he was incandescent with rage. "I hope the Vichy people will throw them into the sea," he stormed. "You don't get France by burglary." But by the time he had lunched with a soothing Churchill, de Gaulle had calmed down. That evening he made a broadcast fully in support of the Allied operation. Only when American troops arrived in strength, many hours late due to the chaotic landings, did Darla's attitude change. He asked to meet the commander of the 34th Infantry Division to discuss a ceasefire, and one was agreed for Algiers. French troops would march back to barracks without surrendering their arms. Hitler's suspicions about the reliability of the Vichy regime as an ally flared up. Severing diplomatic relations with the United States was not enough, nor was Pierre Laval's agreement to allow Axis aircraft to use French airfields in Tunisia. On November 9th, Laval was summoned to Munich and challenged to prove his loyalty to Germany by declaring war on the Allies. This was a step too far for Laval, and also for the rest of the administration in Vichy. Darla, meanwhile, would not extend the ceasefire to Casablanca and Oran, where fighting still continued. He needed to know what was happening in Munich and in France. Confusion mounted with the arrival in Algiers of General Giroux, followed by General Marc Clark, who indicated that they should prepare to drop Giroux and deal with Darla instead. Giroux fortunately accepted that Darla was his senior and did not make a fuss. But Eisenhower, back in the humid tunnels of the Rock of Gibraltar, had only a few confusing reports on which to assess progress. Nothing had been heard from General Patton on the Casablanca landings. A keyed-up Eisenhower chain-smoked his Camel cigarettes and prayed for the best. In Munich, Hitler, accompanied by Count Ciano, Mussolini's foreign secretary, received Laval and demanded that French troops should secure ports and airfields in Tunisia for the landing of Axis troops. French resentment against Italy, after Mussolini's stab in the back in June 1940, was so intense that Laval hesitated over allowing Italian forces on French territory. But he indicated that he would bow to a German ultimatum, providing Marshal Pétain could make a formal protest. The next morning, November 10th, Darla came to the Hotel St. George in Algiers, which Clark had taken over as his headquarters. Clark's undiplomatic manner did not go down well with Darla, who emphasized that he held a much more senior rank. Clark even threatened to impose Allied military government on the whole of French North Africa. Darla kept his temper, because he had to play for time. He could not order the ceasefire which Clark so urgently wanted until Hitler ordered troops into the demilitarized zone of France, thus breaching the 1940 armistice agreement. Eisenhower, on hearing from Clark that negotiations had stalled, exploded, "Jesus Christ! What I need around here is a damned good assassin." At least Oran was secured that day by the U.S. 1st Infantry Division at the cost of 300 casualties, but French forces were still resisting Patton's troops in Morocco even after almost all their warships had been sunk off Casablanca in a furious battle. Early the next day, Hitler announced that German troops would occupy southern and southeastern France in Operation Anton. He would still recognize Pétain's government, but the Marshal's reputation was now in tatters. Many of his supporters felt that he should have fled to North Africa to join the Allies. Hitler also gave orders that the Pyrenees should be occupied by German troops. Franco's government feared that Hitler might demand the passage of troops through Spain to attack Gibraltar, and a council of ministers in Madrid on November 13 ordered a partial mobilization. With the German move into the unoccupied zone of France, Darla was now able to argue that Pétain was a prisoner. He gave instructions that the ceasefire should extend throughout French North Africa. But Darla did not manage to deliver the French fleet in Toulon, as Churchill had hoped. The commander there, Contre-Amiral Jean de Laborde, who resented Darla and feared that his sailors and officers wanted to join the hated Anglo-Saxons, remained loyal to Vichy in splendid isolation. Assured by officers of the Kriegsmarine that German forces would not try to seize his ships or the port of Toulon, Laborde decided to stay put. But the arrival of SS panzer troops and increasing dissent among his crews forced him to make up his mind. As German forces entered the port, he gave the order to scuttle the fleet. Almost 100 warships were sunk or blown up. Operation Torch had cost the Allies 2,225 casualties, of whom roughly half were killed, and the French lost around 3,000. As both Patton and Clark acknowledged, the chaos of the landings had been lamentable. If they had been fighting the German army instead of badly armed French colonial troops, they would have been massacred. British officers made supercilious jokes about how green is our ally, but the disorganization and chaotic logistics made painful reading in the after-action reports. Above all, it proved that General Marshall's desire to launch an early invasion of France would have led to catastrophe. Whatever the motives of Churchill and General Brooke in forcing the Americans to invade North Africa, the result was undeniably the right one. The U.S. Army had a great deal to learn before it could take on the Wehrmacht in Northern Europe or even in Tunisia. The morale of troops is often volatile, swinging wildly between dejection and exultation. The easy victory in Morocco and Algeria prompted an unsustainable optimism. Their mood boosted by the cheap local wine, American soldiers believed that they had been blooded and were almost battle-hardened. Those who had seen the obsolete French Renault tanks brought to a halt with their new bazookas yelled, "Bring on the Panzers!" Even Eisenhower told Roosevelt that he expected to take Tripoli by late January.